Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and I'm pleased to welcome you all to this event hosted by the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, reflecting on America's departure from Afghanistan. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our viewers on C-SPAN. We are delighted to be joined by such an excellent panel whose lives the 2-decade-long U.S. war in Afghanistan touched in different ways. We're going to be fortunate to hear their perspective born of personal experience and broader expertise on national and global security issues. First, Elliot Ackerman is a decorated Marine Corps veteran and the author of the new book, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan. It's a striking and must-read personal history of the war in Afghanistan. Elliot, I'm proud to have actually the advanced uncorrected proofs, which is where I read this book. Thank you for that early view, and it's really a riveting read. Elliot is a remarkable novelist as well, an original thinker, and one of the few people I know who can write both nonfiction and fiction equally brilliantly. This is the first time that Elliot has been back at the Atlantic Council since the passing of his remarkable father, Peter, a dear friend of mine, a member of our board's executive committee. I know how much he would have liked to be here, Elliot, and I also know how proud he was of you and of your mathematician wrestler brother, Nate. And so please pass our best wishes to Nate as well. Admiral James Stavridis is a member of the Atlantic Council's board of directors, and he had a distinguished career in the Navy. I think distinguished is an understatement, rising to the level of 4-star admiral and serving as the 16th Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, where he oversaw operations in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, the Balkans, and counter-piracy off the coast of Africa. He was the longest-serving combatant commander in recent U.S. history. He writes regularly, having published 12 books and hundreds of articles. I'm sure you've seen him on television as well. He's one of the most important voices on foreign affairs and the future of warfare anywhere. And I'm going to flog another book, 2034. This was one that Elliot wrote together with Admiral Stavridis, and it's just an absolutely brilliant piece of futurology and fiction writing. And then finally, Laila Koastani and Nilofar Saki are two of our outstanding non-resident senior fellows affiliated with our Scowcroft Center and South Asia Center, respectively. Both have extensive experience in dealing with issues of Afghanistan from security and peace building perspectives. And Matt Koenig, our moderator for today, will go into that more in a minute. And convenings such as this one are integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges of our day. At the same time, we honor the legacy of General Scowcroft. America's final withdrawal from Afghanistan around this time last year marked the end of a war that reshaped that country and many other things as well. The United States entered Afghanistan after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, degrading al-Qaeda and eventually killing Osama bin Laden, while temporarily removing the Taliban regime. Tens of thousands of lives from everyday Afghans to were transformed and lost along the way. Today, our panel will reflect on the past, looking forward as well, and we'll hear personal reflections, including some of the really strong themes from Elliot's new book. 1 year after U.S. withdrawal, Afghanistan faces an uncertain, grim future. What will its future hold? How will the withdrawal affect America's role in the region in the long term? So with that, let me pass to Matt Koenig, acting director of the Scowcroft Center, who will moderate this event. And finally, before I pass you, Matt, buy both of those books. Over to you, Matt.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Fred. It's an honor to be here today moderating this panel. And Fred did a good job of setting the stage for today's discussion. I think there are really two occasions. One is the 1 year anniversary, roughly 1 year of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, ending America's involvement in its longest war. And so this raises big questions we'll discuss today about American strategy, about the experiences of our service members, about conditions on the ground today in Afghanistan, and about efforts to resettle the Afghans who aided the U.S. war effort. But the second occasion, as Fred mentioned, is the publication of Eliot's new book, The Fifth Act, which is a terrific book. So congratulations, Eliot, and I highly recommend it. So the plan for today is for me to moderate a discussion with our distinguished panel. I'll do that for 35 minutes or so. And then I will turn to the audience for questions and answers. So be thinking of your questions now. And if you want to ask a question, you can do that in the Q&A function here on Zoom, or you can also ask a question on Twitter using the hashtag The Fifth Act. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin the discussion. And Eliot, you're the author of this terrific new book. I think we'll start with you. And I just finished the book last night, and I really enjoyed it. I wish I could write the way that you do, nonfiction that reads like fiction, really gripping narrative about, well, maybe I'll let you do it. Tell us about this book and tell us why you decided to write it.
First of all, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Fred, and thank you to everyone at the Atlantic Council for having us today to talk about the end of Afghanistan and reflect on how this war finished 1 year ago. But specific to your question, Matt, I think that it comes of why I wrote this book kind of comes a little bit in the title of the book. Why is it called The Fifth Act: America's End in Afghanistan? And about a year ago, as Afghanistan was falling, as the Taliban were moving into Kabul, I was just asked to contribute a 500-word essay amongst a series of essays about the situation in Afghanistan. And a friend of mine who's the editor who asked me to contribute, I said, well, what do you want me to write about? And she said, well, most people in America really haven't been following this story. And maybe you could just summarize kind of what's happened in the last 20 years, because everybody thinks they feel it's a tragedy. And it was, well, first of all, the idea of trying to summarize a 20-year war in 500 words on its face, I think is sort of like an absurd writing assignment. But her use of the word tragedy got me thinking, as I tried to approach that very small assignment, was that yes, this is a tragedy. I think, people have asked, why did so many Americans feel this so viscerally when we pulled out? And if you look at tragedies, from Shakespeare all the way back to the ancients, tragedies typically follow a 5-act structure. And so in this very small little bit of writing, I just tried to write about the presidencies of George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, President Joe Biden, and the 5th act becomes the Taliban. So that sort of gave me a structure. And in the book, you'll see there's an overarching framework talking about what I believe are key themes in the war, administration to administration, because one of the things that does make this war somewhat unique is the numbers of administrations that presided over it. But then the book also, is part memoir. And so when I originally signed up to write this book, I was going to write a short 30,000 word. I was going to be released as a paperback original, and it was going to be sort of just more politics, policy related, kind of what's happened in Afghanistan. And then within about 3 weeks of signing up to do that, like many veterans, many journalists, many activists, really anyone who was invested in Afghanistan over those past 20 years, as the country was falling to the Taliban, my entire network just lit up with people I knew asking for help, but primarily, friends of friends of friends asking for help. And, like so many others, I was immersed in, what some people have called this digital Dunkirk, this sort of crowdsourced evacuation out of Afghanistan. So we have the 5 political acts of the book, but I also, in the book, want to tell the story of really 5 distinct evacuation cases that I was closely involved with over the summer. And, each of the 5, frankly, had different outcomes, some happy and some not so happy. And then the last kind of through line in the book, and I think this was a theme that really ran across the entire effort in Afghanistan last summer, is, what does it mean to make good on the idea of that we don't leave anyone behind, which is a code that's really central in the U.S. military, but is not unique to the U.S. military. It's really an idea that is as old as war. And if you look back to the most ancient stories we tell about war, for instance, to the Iliad, the way the Iliad ends is after Achilles kills Hector, he drags Hector's body back to his camp. And one of the final scenes is King Priam, king of the Trojans, pleading with Achilles to allow him to return his son home so he can have a proper burial, kind of living up to that ideal of we don't leave anyone behind. And so that was a theme that really it runs through the book. That's also why it's very memoiristic. And last summer caused me to reflect on, particularly one incident in Afghanistan, an ambush I was involved in where one of my comrades was killed and we struggled to get his body out. And it caused that memory to really get dredged back up to the surface for me and to ask this question, what does it mean to me to leave no one behind? And what does it mean to our nation to leave no one behind? So the book kind of moves around a lot in time. It kind of goes up to the 50,000 foot policy level, but then also I think goes right down to the on the ground realities, both of last summer, but even the war itself and battles fought more than a decade ago. So that's sort of how I came to write the book.
That's terrific. Thanks, Elliot. And you're an accomplished writer, a New York Times bestselling author. You've published everywhere, and that comes through. As you say, you're also a decorated veteran. 5 tours, I believe, in Iraq and Afghanistan, Purple Heart. So 1 year after the withdrawal, I think one of the things that's compelling about the book is the memoiristic aspect, talking about your time and your friends there. How do you and your the colleagues you served with think about the war in Afghanistan now, 1 year after the U.S. withdrawal?
Well, I think it's when the war was ending, one of the things that was, I think, remarkable for me, and and the book sort of opens in this vein, is how long we had lived with the war. And that really began to resonate as you're trying to wrap your head around what a post-Afghanistan reality looks like. Not for Afghans, which is obviously profound or involved in pulling out there, but for also, just veterans. What does it mean that the war is now over? And in those days and weeks as it was coming to a close last year, I recognized that, I have I've known the war, or I participated in the war, and it's been in my life longer than, for instance, my wife has been in my life. And my children have been in my life. And, those are really sort of obviously the touchstones of anyone's life. And the war had become this sort of touchstone of my life. And not so much that I didn't go to it anymore, but it had always, been there sort of as a unifying thread. And when I look back, you ask about veterans, I look at, the closest relationships I have in my life are with people I served with in the wars, or even people I didn't know in the wars, but who are similarly touched by the wars. And sort of in this strange sense, we all grew up there. So even though the war is over, its legacy lives on in us. But there, I think, has also been a sense 1 year out, and I think, particularly among my cohort of veterans, that there has been this sense that, America, kind of wants to turn the page on Afghanistan. And as much as everyone says, it is clearly unfortunate how things ended there. I don't think anyone would say that the weeks of evacuation were America's brightest hour. But there's this sense of wanting to kind of collectively move on, and that there's nothing else that can be done about Afghanistan. There's, I'd say, a streak of fatalism. And I think that's misguided, because there's still a lot to be done. Not necessarily inside Afghanistan, although, we can talk about that, but we did get, tens of thousands of Afghans into the United States. And many of these Afghans, these are, they might not be American citizens yet, but they are American heroes. These are people who bled alongside us, who bled fighting for objectives that were aligned with our national interests. And now they are here and they are in the United States. And they are currently here on humanitarian parole. So many of them cannot work, and their humanitarian parole, if it's not adjusted, will expire and they will be deported. So there is legislation right now that's sort of wending its way through Congress, the Afghan Adjustment Act, which is really critically important because this will get these people who we evacuated last summer green cards, we'll get them working, and we'll get them on the pathway to citizenship. And as I mentioned, like, these are American heroes. When they become citizens, they're going to become incredible Americans. So as much as we're sort of observing this 1 year mark, it's important to recognize that there is still work to be done, and much good that can come out of how this ended.
Important points, Elliot. There's still work to be done. And I think we'll come back to those themes in a moment when we talk to Lila and some of her ongoing work on resettling Afghans. But first, I wanted to come to you, Admiral Stavridis, a distinguished career, as Fred Kemp pointed out. And you were former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And of course, this was not just a U.S. war, it was a NATO war, the only time Article 5 of NATO has been invoked. And so I want to ask you about that. But first, you're also regarded as one of the country's leading strategic thinkers. So I was hoping we could go big picture and ask you, what does the war in Afghanistan and the lessons learned from the war in Afghanistan mean for U.S. grand strategy? We have debates of end the endless wars. We have debates about whether the chaotic nature of the withdrawal harmed American credibility. But I would love to hear from you. What are some of the major lessons learned at the strategic level from the war in Afghanistan?
I'll be glad to address that, Matt, and I will. I want to begin by just picking up on Elliot's point about what we owe the Afghans who are still in Afghanistan and those who are coming here. And I know Lila and Nyla will have a lot to say on this, but I want to make a point about the immigrant experience. Here you have, I think, a quite extraordinary group of people who have managed to get out of Afghanistan. And like Elliot and many other veterans, I was involved in this and have seen so many different stories about it. And here's the point I want to make. How much courage and true grit does it take to grab your 4-year-old's hand, put your 2-year-old daughter on your back, and claw your way into an airport, get across a border, and somehow find your way to the United States? I want that person on my team. And that first generation will start out doing some fairly pedestrian things. The second generation will be starting great companies. The third generation will be running Ford Motor Company. This will be good for our country. And by the way, don't take my theory of the case. This, of course, is exactly what happened with our withdrawal from Vietnam. And it's worth making that comparison, which many have, about the two experiences. Matt, to get to the strategic level piece of this, let me kind of do it from the inside out, if you will. I think Elliot is right. Many Americans had sort of mentally checked out of the problem of Afghanistan for a variety of reasons we could unpackage, but let's stipulate that not a lot of people were seriously paying attention to what was going on. Then you have this extremely chaotic withdrawal, which does us no credit whatsoever, obviously. And in the course of watching that unfold, I think many Americans kind of shook their head and said, boy, that's what happens when you get involved in these overseas wars. So inside the United States, I think, unfortunately, this will have a chilling effect on other scenarios globally where the United States, in my view, ought to be involved. The real question is, what's the degree of involvement? We've had some very successful engagements, for example, in Colombia. We've had extraordinary success, my view, in the Balkans. We had Iraq, kind of a middle case. We'll see where Iraq lands ultimately. Afghanistan, I think, has been a very hard passage for the nation. But the point is, the Afghan Fifth Act that Elliot illuminates in this brilliant book has I believe, a kind of chilling effect, and others inside the body politic of America will point to it and say, oh, that's why we don't want to be involved in these kind of scenarios. Going from the inside out, next are allies, partners, friends. They look at this, the ending, the fifth act, and they say, U.S. not reliable. U.S. doesn't stand with allies. U.S. can't get organized. U.S. can't orchestrate and work with partners. The disconnects between NATO partners, who ironically had fought together for 20 years in the chaos of the withdrawal, was notable. And it was noted by our allies that the United States, in that instance, in those months, was not stepping up to organize this in a more coherent way. And we could argue about the selection of the date and a number of tactical things that occurred. But broadly speaking, our allies were discouraged, shall we say, watching this. And then third and finally, our opponents, again, inside out, America, our allies, our opponents were emboldened. No question of that. And I think personally, you can drop a plumb line from the events in August to the following February when Putin decided to invade Ukraine. I think he took the wrong lesson from that, and I think he's paying for it mightily. But I think our opponents watched us stumble out of Afghanistan and felt, America can't get organized. America can't get out of its own way. America's internal discord prevents it from acting bravely and truly. I think that's being put as a lie by what's happening today in Ukraine, by the way. But that, I think, has hurt us strategically globally. So, Matt, there's a snapshot. The key thing is to learn the right lessons from this, not the wrong lessons. Thanks.
Well, that was great. Thanks, Admiral Stavridis. And those 3 points, implications domestically for allies and for adversaries, was mostly negative, and that's understandable. Do you also see positive accomplishments in the 20-year war? And I guess maybe related, are there ways that we can maybe mitigate some of those downside consequences that you talk about?
Yeah, I think there is positive effect inside Afghanistan. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Afghans have learned to read as a result of our intervention. We have exposed a generation of Afghans, many of whom are going to be frustrated and bitter, but we've exposed them to broader ideas. We talked a moment ago about the diaspora, which will come from this and has already occurred in many places. These are brilliant, motivated people, and they are going to succeed here. All of that counts on the positive side of the ledger. And then fourth and finally, I'd say the fact that we went to Afghanistan, took apart the al-Qaeda network there, seems to be resurging, of course, but did serious damage to it. And I would say, as a veteran, and I get this question a lot from veterans, what did it all mean? Why did we go? And the answer was we went because we were attacked from Afghanistan. And for the 20 years following 9/11, we were not attacked in any significant way by any global terrorist network. I think that is partly a result of the work of those in Afghanistan, not just the military, obviously, but our diplomats, our Peace Corps volunteers, our AID workers, all of us, I think, can take some pride in that accomplishment. And at the most vengeful level, I suppose you can say we found and killed bin Laden. That's a good thing in my view. So there are some handful of net positives that come out. I think the key is where we made mistakes, as we've articulated, we have to learn from those and calibrate our further engagements in ways that would make this look more like outcomes in Colombia or the Balkans, less like outcomes as we just saw in the fifth act in Afghanistan.
Great. Thank you, Admiral. And both you and Elliot talked about the effort to resettle Afghans who'd worked with us during the war. And so, Lila, I want to come to you next. Of course, you're a veteran as well, former Navy surface officer, a counterterrorism analyst in Afghanistan. an Afghan American who served as a cultural advisor to U.S. Forces there. And since then, you've been working as CEO of Honor the Promise, a nationwide nonprofit focused on the long-term resiliency of our Afghan special operations partners. I know you've been involved in resettling Afghans into the United States. I was hoping maybe you could talk about your efforts doing that. And a basic question is, how are we doing? Are we living up to the promises we made to those who helped us during the war in Afghanistan?
Thank you, Matt. I would say that when people ask me, why did I name the organization Honor the Promise? I do say that it's because I still look at the United States as a promised land for Afghans, as it was for me and for my family. So the idea that someone can travel from across the world to the United States, put their head down, work hard, and make something of themselves deeply resonates. And when you ask, how are we doing? Unfortunately, Matt, not well. Our Afghan partners are oftentimes feeling a sense of languishing. Many of them, unfortunately, do not speak English fluently, very different from our interpreter partners who are eligible for the special immigrant visa. As Elliot mentioned, the majority of Afghans are here through humanitarian parole. And while that does allow them to work with an employment authorization document, this uncertainty of what will happen when that humanitarian parole runs out, as Elliot mentioned, is also potentially impacting the way that employers feel about having Afghans work in their companies or in their organizations. So first and foremost, top of mind is housing. There is a housing crisis in the United States more broadly that is absolutely impacting our Afghan partners' ability to find places where they can actually live and see as their new homes. And then next, of course, is the asylum piece. It's a very complicated, arduous, expensive process. Lawyers are asking upwards of $10,000 per Afghan head of household to file an asylum application, which if you're not working, how can you afford the $10,000 to be able to pay for that asylum application? And then absolutely finding meaningful employment, being able to take care of yourself and your family members that are in the US, but also taking care of family that has been left behind in Afghanistan. Those issues are top of mind. I will say that I am very proud of the veteran and military affiliated communities, the spouses, the children that have come out to all of the various events that we have had across the United States, focusing a light on our Afghan partners and what communities can do at that local level. I've been very uplifted to see that support, but we do need national policies that will address these shortcomings if we are going to make these Afghan partners actually feel included and like they have a livelihood in the US going forward.
Okay, so clear that we're not doing all that we can. If you could wave a magic wand, what are one or two things that you would change? What should the U.S. government be doing? What can people watching online be doing? What can we be doing to improve our efforts in this regard?
First and foremost, Matt, is the Afghan Adjustment Act. I think you could talk to any veteran, anyone who served in any capacity in Afghanistan, frontline civilian, so on and so forth. And all of us are saying, please pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, because the sense of worry that Afghans and all of us that are supporting them, that sense of worry would be alleviated tremendously to know that they are not going to potentially be kicked out of the United States, deported. And it also that allows them that legal status of having a permanent pathway to citizenship will allow them to reunify with their families. So that stress, that unpredictability, the not knowing of what will happen to them is absolutely having an impact on their mental health, on their resiliency, on their ability to go to work every day, to learn English. It is a barrier to progress for our Afghan partners. So if I was queen for a day, that would be the very first thing that I would focus on or ask our government to pass. But then at the community level, I would ask anybody, doesn't matter what race you are, what gender you are, what languages you speak. Just please open up your community, help open up your community to Afghans. They are not going to learn to integrate at the societal level, at the community level, if they are only spending time with other members of the Afghan community. They need an opportunity to actually learn about American culture, to understand community benefits that exist, to interact with community level organizations. While I see this as a nationwide and national problem, I believe that the solutions are local. And so in any way that at the local level, you as a US citizen, as an American citizen, you may have never spent any time in Afghanistan. It's okay. If you see an Afghan, work with a resettlement agency, just reach out, invite them to come grocery shopping with you, invite their children to come to a play date with you. These seem like very small asks, but they have a tremendous impact on the mental well-being and the feelings of inclusion for our Afghan partners.
Very powerful. Thanks, Lila. There's something we can all do to contribute if we'd like to. Nilofar, I think I'd like to come to you next. You're a senior fellow with us at the Council, a lecturer at George Washington University. You're also an author of Human Security and Agency, Reframing Productive Power in Afghanistan. You've been involved in the Afghan peace process for over a decade, and your recent research has focused on conditions on the ground in Afghanistan. And Admiral Stavridis was talking about how that's one of the areas where the United States made a difference while it was there. Now, of course, the Taliban has taken back over and signs that it's not living up to the promises it made to uphold women's rights and other things. But you're tracking this closely. How do you assess what's going on on the ground in Afghanistan currently?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Atlantic Council, for organizing this event. And congratulations, Elliot, for the book. I haven't read it, but I'm certainly going to buy it and read it. Well, yes, as you mentioned, I have been closely following the Afghanistan issues, both on the ground and in the region, what the Taliban takeover meant for Afghans and for the region. I've done my research and written a lot on that from last 1 year. It was a difficult year for Afghanistan. It was unexpected. Initially, it was shocking for the population in large. And it was the Taliban takeover overall was a tragedy for Afghans, particularly for the educated class, for the progressive class, and for the products of those, the people who were the products of those last 20 years that one of our colleagues were talking over here. A replacement of a republic, though a very fragile system and a very new republic, by a totalitarian system and a group like Taliban who have a track record of severe human rights violation in the past and who have close ties with a transitional terrorist group was not a good news for Afghanistan. It was, of course, certainly a bad one, specifically for a particular segment of society who believed in democracy and rule of law, and who were from the educated class of the society. Now, what was happening? There was high level of misinformation, by the way, last year. That all of us as a researcher, most of us as a researcher, who were not able to really track the exact data from the ground for several reasons. First, of course, there were a ban on certain segments of society, like there was restrictions on freedom of expression. There was detention of journalists, especially journalists who belong to the last 20 years of media reporting. There were ban on the intellectuals to come and speak up. They tried at the beginning to speak up about different issues, but they were detained, they were jailed. So there were all kind of atrocities for the first few months of the Taliban takeover that it was a complex situation, and accessing to information was very difficult. But overall, the situation is still very grim. There is reporting about the better security, and there is reporting about the reduced corruption. There are two aspects of the reporting that we have been hearing. But again, the facts are not there to really have the exact data. About the security, yes, there has been a reduced level of direct attacks. And by direct attacks, I mean, of course, Taliban were a party in the armed conflict last 20 years. So it certainly demonstrated that they are in power. So it means that there should be some level of reduction in the direct attacks, like bombing, like public attacks, and many more. Assassinations that used to be last 20 years of tactics of the Taliban and other insurgent groups. That has been reduced based on data, but the nature of insecurities have changed. So therefore, as a person who follows security and studies security, I would argue differently. I would say that the security crises are still there. That hasn't been reduced from my lens, based on the fact that there has been changes in the nature of insecurities. Now, that change means what? Now there are extrajudicial killings, which replaced some of those tactics that used to be from last 20 years. There are detention, there are suppression of voices, there are killings of minorities and groups who are raising their voices against the system. And there are all other kinds of small levels of insurgency from across the country who are against the regime, against the Taliban regime, that by itself creates a different level of insecurity. And on the other hand, we have seen also ISKP, who have further organized itself. We have seen the presence of TTP, Tehrik-e-Taliban in Pakistan, who have been extended across the country. We have seen Jamaat-e-Ansarullah of Tajikistan, who have taken shape in the northern part of Afghanistan, particularly in Badakhshan and Panjshir Badakhshan provinces. So there are this kind of new emergence of new insurgencies and reorganization of new and transnational terrorist groups, particularly the presence of Al-Qaeda also, which Zawahiri strike was demonstrating that a lot. I think these are the facts that can give us hint that, well, the security crises are still there, still dire, still urgent, still can pose serious threats to the region and to the West for a long term if it's not prevented and tackled well. So that's about the security. On the other hand, the safety. The safety has been another issue that we have seen. There's a high level of data that shows us about the lack of safety of people. For example, again, I mentioned the particular segment of society, the educated, progressive, they are being tortured, detained, and suppressed in different forms of format. Women, the 50% of the population, which data demonstrate that, they have been deprived of their basic rights and needs. And on the other hand, the high refugee crisis in the region, people leave the country because of course, the humanitarian and economic crisis, which has taken shape from last 1 year. On the other hand, the suppression of their rights and lack of access to basic resources and basic rights. So that undermines the dignity of Afghans. Therefore, they leave the country. So there are all kinds of other safety crises which have emerged from last 1 year of the Taliban takeover, which the country is going to struggle with and is still struggling with. So they are framing new narratives of security and safety in the country and what it means for Afghanistan, what it means for the regional peace, and what it means for the West in the long term if they are not tackled seriously. On the other hand, the regional aspect is also important to mention here. I think we have seen the changes in the region since the Taliban takeover with the US troops withdrawal. There has perceived to be a vacuum of power. Therefore, China extending its role in the region, and of course, Russia got very busy with the invasion of Ukraine. But I would see Russia would also get engaged more politically in the region, and what it means for the other countries and how they align their relationship with this emerged powers. Which I wrote about the role of Iran, China, and Russia, and what the Taliban takeover means for the country, for the region in large, and how their relationship with the Taliban shape the security architecture of the region. So there are all kinds of pieces that still some of us are struggling with in order to further frame. But overall, my argument and thesis would be that the security crises are still dire, still very severe, and they are reshaping differently. There are different formats of insecurities, which does not mean at all that there has been a reduction of insecurities and a security crisis in Afghanistan. I stop there.
Great. Thanks very much, Niloufar. And I noticed as you were talking, there were a bunch of related questions popping up in the Q&A. So I think we'll come back to you and that portion of the discussion. I also noticed it looked like Elliot, the author of our new book, was ready to jump in on this subject. And Elliot, if I could just build on that, reading the book, there's the narrative part, which is compelling, the memoir part that's compelling, but near the end, you do get into a policy discussion, and you have some, I think, very trenchant analysis and recommendations. And in particular, you raise the issues of deficit funding for our wars, the all-volunteer military force, and some of the implications that has. I was wondering if you could share some of those insights with the audience.
Sure. And, just so for a second to go from an Afghan-specific discussion to kind of an American war-making discussion, every war that the United States has fought since the revolution has had to have a construct to sustain it. And that by that, I mean, generally speaking, to sustain it in two terms, blood and treasure. Who's going to fight the war and how are we going to pay for it? So if we look back over our history, for instance, one of the constructs of the U.S. Civil War was the blood. Well, the first ever draft in this country's nation is a result of our Civil War, as is the first ever income tax. And the Second World War was a war that was characterized by a national mobilization and war bond drives. We look at the Vietnam War. That's a war we remember because of a very unpopular draft that led to an anti-war movement that ultimately ended the war. When 9/11 happens and America once again has to mobilize to go to war, there needs to be this construct to sustain it. And the construct we very quickly settle on is one in which the war will be fought by an all-volunteer military, and the funding will come out of our deficit. In fact, the last year the United States passed a balanced budget was, not by coincidence, 2001. But the result of that construct is that the American people are anesthetized to the cost of war. So if you were to ask me, why does the war in Afghanistan go on for 20 years? Why do we have these forever wars? It is less due to battlefield conditions and more due to the constructs of the war that allow them to proceed through 4 different administrations, because politically it becomes very easy to continue prosecuting these sort of low-grade wars. Another thing it does for us just societally as Americans is, wars used to be something that were experienced generationally. They were generationally defining events. The Vietnam War, a generationally defining event. The Second World War, the greatest generation. Even the First World War, the lost generation. When I look at my own generation and how we experienced the 9/11 wars, I have never felt like I was part of a lost generation. I've actually felt more like I was sort of the lost part of a generation. And as we look at American society writ large, where we see these trends of atomization, all of us sort of descending into our various subgroups, it becomes a very unhealthy thing for our democracy when the military follows that trend of atomization, where wars are just fought by a subsection of our society. And as we kind of hit the end of 20 years of war, as much as we're talking about the geopolitics, of Afghanistan and how it relates to Ukraine and how it relates to authoritarianism around the globe, it's also, I think, equally important, if not more critically important, to reflect on how these wars were waged inside of America, how we are waging wars. And I would just finish by saying, I think it's particularly essential to do that because, as Admiral Stavridis noticed, our adversaries look at us and I think correctly say, our own internal dysfunction stands in our way from holding up a real shield for, Western liberal values around the world. And if the greatest national security threat to the United States is our own internal domestic dysfunction, it's probably important as we come out of the wars in Afghanistan to also ask if we're waging our wars the right way in the future. And I'll show my hand here. I think that, if waging wars where society writ large does not have skin in the game probably isn't the way to wage war going forward, because it leads to these types of 10, 20-year conflicts.
Important insights. Thanks, Elliot. So I do want to go to Q&A now. So I see that we have a number of questions in the chat, some coming in on Twitter. So if you'd like to join the conversation, please do ask your question in the Q&A function or on Twitter with the hashtag The Fifth Act. I think we'll go first to Jim Gilmore, former ambassador to the OSCE, former governor of Virginia. And this question is for you, Admiral Stavridis. Can you tell us the U.S. military assessment? Well, essentially, was there an alternative to the total withdrawal? Was there some kind of U.S. presence that could have remained in Afghanistan and prevented this outcome? So please, Admiral.
Governor, thank you for attending the webinar, and thanks for a great question. In the shortest answer, I think, yes, there was an alternative. Obviously, the Biden administration disagrees with that view. Just to kind of do the numbers for people, when I commanded this mission for 4 years, we had 150,000 troops there. By the time we get to close to the withdrawal, we're down to 15,000. Here I'm talking about coalition troops, about 15,000. So we'd already withdrawn 90% of the troops before we then started to chip away. Both Trump administration and then the Biden administration comes in and pulls out the very last tranche. My own view, and this is arguable, my own view is we should have maintained, I'd say ballpark 10,000 troops, coalition. I think the Euros would have gladly put up 5,000 to 7,000. We could have made up the bulk of that, provided intelligence, logistics, ongoing engagement. The counter to this, which the Biden team will tell you, and it's a good counter, is, oh no, the Taliban were just waiting. They were poised. They were ready to strike at a moment's notice. The counterfactual, who knows what would have happened if we'd maintained a mission there. President Biden gets paid to make really big, really hard decisions. I respect him for doing that. His call was, nope, we're going to cut the cord. We're out of here. It's the 20-year point. I think we could have maintained 10,000, 15,000 tops. And frankly, that's a de minimis level of deployment for the United States and Europe. We have 40,000 troops in Korea. We have 60,000 troops in Europe. I think those are good numbers. Personally, I would have kept 10,000 U.S. troops there quite gladly, see what the next turn of the wheel is. We'll never know how that would have come out, but I look at the evidence of how we did during this withdrawal period as a possibility, I think a pretty good one, that we could have continued the march. President made a different decision.
Thank you, Admiral. So I'm seeing here that there's a function where the speakers can indicate they'd like to respond to questions. And Lila, I see you'd like to respond to this question from Warren Coates. How is it possible that after 20 years, our military never prepared the Afghans to fight on their own?
Yes, it's a question that I hear very often. And I will say that the Afghans don't have a problem fighting. And I think that anyone who has spent time in Afghanistan can attest to this. Elliot, you can probably attest to this as a Marine. There's no issue of fighting. They're willing to fight. They want to fight. They've been fighting. And just in terms of the numbers, the numbers do not lie. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Afghans have taken up arms in Afghanistan over the last several decades and fought and died. And so fighting is not the issue. The greater issue for all of us to really think about is when we create a system that is so incredibly complex, and then we also centralize it, and then we say to a different country, best of luck to you as we leave, then we can't expect a positive outcome. We taught the Afghan military to be subservient to a civilian authority, which we should, But that civilian authority, that government misused the Afghan security forces. I have been saying that for years. Many other analysts would tell you that for years. And so the US military, I think, did a very good job of helping Afghans learn how to use our weapon systems, our helicopters, our ways of doing operations. And while we were there and we could mentor and train and advise, those went well. Those operations went well because we were there to support from the logistical side. But the Afghan government, highly centralized in the way that they did logistics. And I have heard numerous Afghan security force partners say, Lila, there have been times when I felt like I was fighting the Taliban and my own government at the exact same time because I could not get the resources that I needed in a timely manner. And so the issue is not fighting. Afghans have fought. They will no doubt continue to fight. That is not the issue, the problem. Our military did fight alongside those Afghans. They fought alongside us. But what we did not do is actually help them learn the PhD level of military operations, which is that logistical piece. How are they going to be sustainable? We never created a system that was sustainable.
Yeah, let me just add one really simple analogy to that, agreeing completely with Lila. If you go back to the American Revolution and look at the protagonists in that, we trained an army of redcoats. We should have trained them to be Minutemen. The Taliban were the Minutemen. They had light logistics. They moved quickly. They shot from behind cover. We trained the way we fight. And that, I think, was the heart of our error. And I think all of us in the military who are in decision-making roles need to own that part of the miscalculation.
Well, and there's another point also. It was not only about the forces of fighting. It was not only about the NSF, Afghanistan National Security Forces, and their capability. There were all political dynamics involved in the entire process, why it weakened the Afghan forces. And I think those political events and political dynamics have been influential in undermining the confidence and courage of the Afghan National Security Forces to step down their guns in many districts when Taliban were approaching. And I think the Doha process by itself was kind of that political event which undermined the confidence of the Afghan forces on the ground, in addition to many other impacts that it had on the overall political scenarios happening in Afghanistan. But I think that had its influence and impact on the Afghan national forces on the ground.
Yeah, I think it's irresistible and unfortunate, but I'll make the comparison. Ashraf Ghani, Volodymyr Zelensky. Leadership matters. How leaders comport themselves under fire matters. In this case, Nila's point, the political will that you see in Ukraine simply was lacking.
Thank you all. Good insights. And looking at the clock, I think we have time for maybe just one more question. And I see again using this function that Elliot Ackerman would like to respond to a question from Samantha Sloan at American University. How can the U.S. rehabilitate its international credibility as a defender and advocate of human rights? What should the U.S. do to mitigate the effect of its failures on the Afghan people, particularly women? So Elliot, if you could respond to that, and with time running down, any final thoughts you'd like to leave with the audience would be welcome as well.
Thank you. I think there's a great deal the United States can do to rehabilitate its reputation abroad, and I think we are doing it in part in Ukraine, and I think it's remarkable as we sit here 1 year out to just recognize the year we've lived, one in which as mentioned, the only time NATO has evoked Article 5, we see that end with, I would argue, probably one of NATO's darkest hours, which was this evacuation from the airport. We all saw the images a year ago, but then within 6 months of that, at sort of head dizzying speed, we see one of NATO's brightest hours, which is the way the alliance stands firm and overperforms in the face of Russian aggression in Ukraine. So, Afghanistan, there's a tendency, at least I observe in our national conversation, to sort of stovepipe Afghanistan as though it's a single country that exists in a vacuum, and we talk about it as though it doesn't relate to the rest of the world and the United States. I mean, it certainly does. We just tied a thread between Afghanistan and Ukraine, and had NATO not stood firm with Ukraine, and had Ukraine not mounted this historic and heroic defense, and had Russia rolled through Ukraine, what would we probably be talking about? We would probably be talking, although we are already talking about it, but in much more earnest terms, what the future of Taiwan was going to be, because we would then be watching a rising axis of authoritarian nations just sort of sweeping across the globe. So I think it's important to keep Afghanistan front of mind, because Afghanistan matters in the global balance of power as it exists with all of these other issues. Wouldn't it be nice right now if we still had access as the United States and as NATO to these air bases that share a border with China? So
And
I
Russia.
think going forward, yes, well, in that little snippet with China.
No, China's
And,
the little one, but yeah.
Listen, I think going forward, the United States might say that it's done with Afghanistan, but Afghanistan isn't certainly done with the United States, and we need to continue to watch that space.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. I feel like we've only begun to scratch the surface on some of these issues, but unfortunately, I think we need to leave it there because we're out of time. I would have loved to have gone to Nilofar to go more on the human rights situation. I see we have some great questions from some experts in our network, Harlan Ullman, Ira Strauss. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to you. But let me just wrap us up here. Thank our terrific panelists for joining us today. Nilofar, Lila, Admiral Stavridis, Elliot, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for attending today's event. And if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend The Fifth Act by Elliot Ackerman. Terrific book, and really does present nonfiction like fiction. It's a compelling read. So thank you all very much, and please come back to Atlantic Council events in the near future. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.